11. Manu stood at the coat rack, slipping on his jacket.
Just as he was about to turn and leave, a hand grabbed him roughly by the arm and yanked him back.
He flinched, spun around, and groaned inwardly.
It was Martin, standing uncomfortably close, glaring at him with narrowed eyes. Manu tried to step back, but Martin's iron grip on his arm made that impossible.
What? Manu finally said. Martin's gaze flickered. You and I are the same, he said abruptly.
Manu paused, confused. I seriously doubt that, he thought. What? He said aloud.
Martin ignored him. You will figure it out soon enough, don't worry.
Manu swallowed hard. His arms started to throb. Figure what out? He asked apprehensively. Martin slowly lowered his hand, his face twisting into a grimace that was probably meant to be a smile.
That we crazy ones are actually the sane ones, he replied.
A chill ran down Manu's spine. He was relieved Martin had let go of his arm and decided this was the perfect moment to make his escape. Right. I gotta go, he said, turning to leave. We'll talk some other time, he called out, already rushing toward the door. Martin didn't move. He just followed Manu with an amused gaze.
I know, he muttered thoughtfully.
Then he began to hum All I Have to Do Is Dream under his breath. After stumbling out of the Chrysler building in a near panic, Manu decided to take refuge in the nearby grove, before Martin had a chance to follow him. Once he'd passed the entrance and rounded a bend in the path, he slowed his pace. As he wandered, still slightly out of breath, he felt the gentle spring breeze caress his face and gradually began to recover from the bizarre encounter.
Today was undoubtedly the strangest day of his life.
What had Martin said to him? We crazy ones are actually the sane ones. And that he and Manu were alike.
What had he meant by that?
And then there was that weird thing with the note where Martin had written the word God. That was seriously bizarre. Manu wished he could understand what had prompted it. But then he decided it was probably better not to dwell too much on the whims of someone who was clearly unhinged. Better not to know what went on in a mind like that, it might pull you into its twisted world. Manu already had enough problems of his own and didn't need any more. He stopped and glanced at his phone. 11:52 a.m. He thought about how to kill time before his meeting with Jens. If he spent an hour walking through the park, he'd still have another one to spare. On a whim, he decided to make a quick trip to the nearby shopping center to pick up some groceries. It was on the south side of the city forest, near downtown. From there, it would be easy to catch a bus or e-scooter to Jens' place and still be on time.
A good plan, Manu thought.
She stood in the middle of the towering trees, scanning her surroundings. The park was beautifully designed, she thought, especially the dynamic contrast between dense wood and open green spaces dotted with crocuses and other early bloomers. But of course, it was no match for the lush vegetation of her homeland, which she already missed terribly. Compared to that, everything here, even the landscape, felt drab. And the social climate was much colder than the place she had left just a few weeks ago.
So much colder.
She had been prepared for this, but naturally, she hadn't been able to imagine just how different it would be here, how much more painful. The alienation from nature, from one another, the pervasive loneliness and emotional desolation of the people here had been acutely evident to her since her arrival. Back home, such conditions were largely unknown, for reasons directly tied to her people's way of life. She truly was a stranger in a strange land, and she knew she wouldn't last here long. The thought that this existence, the way life was for the people here, was their normality, with no awareness of anything beyond it, nothing higher, it chilled her to the bone. All the more reason to complete her mission and find him, the one who had temporarily lost his path. She knew intuitively, here and now, All the threads were converging. The elders, especially her teacher, had prophesied that she would receive visions at the right time to guide and protect her. And so it had come to pass. Now she had to trust those visions, trust that they would lead her to a path that crossed his.
12.
Mana stood by the path, studying a structure made of sticks and branches, roughly 6 feet tall. He wondered what purpose the teepee-like wooden construction might serve. It was too riddled with gaps to offer any real shelter from the elements. On previous walks through the woods, he'd come across similar formations, some quite intricate with artfully woven twigs, and often very beautiful to look at. He figured they were the work of the same kind of people who did guerrilla knitting, wrapping trees, lampposts, or other public objects in yarn to beautify them. Most of the time, though, Mana would just think, is it art or can it go? Especially when the knitted covers were reduced to faded tatters hanging off the objects. Manu's train of thought was interrupted when he noticed a silhouette in the distance, emerging from the trees and slowly moving toward him. What immediately caught his attention about the figure, soon revealed to be a young woman, were her careful, gracefully flowing movements. When she was only a few feet away, her beauty took his breath away. She was about his height, with long, wavy chestnut hair and golden, radiant skin. Her amber eyes were slightly slanted, her high cheekbones striking, and her chin noble and upright. Yet her features defied categorization into any specific ethnicity. A black feather was woven into a front lock of her hair, and she wore subtle turquoise earrings that accentuated her exotic appearance. Mana had never seen such an impossibly beautiful, nearly flawless face.
He stood there, gaping at her with his mouth open.
She met his gaze with clear, attentive eyes full of warmth and curiosity. Finally, a smile played across her lips, and she said, "Are you Mana?" Her voice reminded him of the soft chime of wind bells or a bamboo flute, and though she had spoken only 3 words, a peculiar accent was noticeable. When Mana slowly nodded, she continued. Her words flowed like the melody of a gently cascading mountain stream. "I've been waiting a long time to meet you, Manu," she said, her eyes full of intensity that seemed to pierce straight to his soul. "I was beginning to fear I wouldn't find you in time." "How do you know my name?" Mana stammered, feeling the urge to pinch himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. She hesitated, glanced away briefly, then looked him in the eyes again. "That's a long story. And for reasons that are too complicated to explain right now, we don't have much time."
Her expression grew serious.
"I've come to warn you, Mana. Your life is in grave danger."
The words reached him as if from a great distance.
When they finally sank in, they only deepened the surreal feeling that had overtaken him with the arrival of this mysterious stranger. He was now fully expecting to wake up in his bed, marveling at what tricks his brain had played on him this time.
In what way, he finally managed to ask, his voice shaky.
The woman, apparently noticing his inner turmoil, gave him a compassionate look. "You've grown up in an environment where people have largely forgotten that the world is a magical place, where life revolves around the pursuit of material goods, and self-interest has become the ultimate religion. People here are like sleepwalkers, disconnected from one another, from their own souls, and blind to the wonders of the natural world that surrounds and sustains them. Until recently, you were one of those sleepers, moving through the world with your eyes closed. And in a way, that protected you. But in this world I'm describing, there's not just light, there are also dark, antagonistic forces lurking in the shadows. Your recent dreams, and the implications they've brought, have drawn their attention to you."
"I don't understand," Manu began.
"I know. Listen to me, Manu," she interrupted. "You must do something very important, something that will save your life. You must travel to Portugal to participate in a Naha ceremony. And you must do so as soon as possible." She fell silent, watching him intently. "Nah, what?" Mana stammered. No, she replied. There was a long pause as they gazed at each other in silence.
And what is that? Manu finally asked. She nodded, her eyes still fixed on his.
A small shrub that mainly grows in the Peruvian and Bolivian rainforests, also known as pata, short for pata de pantera. An extract made from its roots opens people's eyes. She paused again, carefully observing Manu's reaction. Panther paw, he murmured, perplexed.
He looked up at her questioningly. And why Portugal?
She held his gaze for a long moment, making him alternately hot and cold. Then she lowered her eyes. You're expected there, she said simply. This was not the answer Mana had expected, but at this point, nothing surprised him anymore. Just as he was about to ask where exactly in Portugal he was supposed to find the person or people waiting for him, she seemed to read his mind and said, Your dreams will guide you.
She smiled. Trust them.
She removed the feather from her hair and held it out to him.
A keepsake. And for protection, she said softly.
Mana was strangely moved by this gesture. He reached out to take the feather, but just as his hand was about to close around it, it slipped from her fingers and fell to the ground.
He bent down to pick it up.
When he straightened, the mysterious beauty was gone, vanished as if into thin air.
Tieton.
The small internet cafe called NetHub, owned by Jens, wasn't exactly downtown, but still within the inner city ring. Until a few years ago, he had operated the business in a different building on the opposite side of town. But then the opportunity arose to rent the ground floor of the multi-unit building where he himself lived. Previously, a small bicycle shop had occupied the space, buying used bikes, refurbishing them, and selling them at affordable prices. For reasons unknown to Jens, the owner had suddenly closed the shop. From a neighbor, Jens had heard the rumor that the owner had fallen seriously ill and was no longer able to continue running the business. He certainly hadn't gone bankrupt. Jens knew the shop had been doing very well, thanks in part to its favorable location for walk-in customers. When the chance to rent the ground floor apartment presented itself, Jens didn't hesitate for a second. Apart from the good, relatively central location, he had been increasingly dissatisfied with the previous location of his own cafe, which had only ever done moderately well. This situation was compounded by the fact that internet cafes had become something of a relic from the 2000s, as almost every household now had its own high-speed connection. For this reason, Jens had long considered throwing in the towel. But when the bike shop vacated the space, he regained hope and decided to give it another shot. Moreover, the idea of going back to a regular job as an employee didn't appeal to him. He had been his own boss for too long, and at 45, the prospect of retraining, or worse, starting a new apprenticeship, was not something he was willing to entertain. Jens sat behind a broad, counter-like desk at the back of the room, a bulky monitor in front of him. From his seat, he had a good view of the space. Along the walls extending from his position toward the entrance were several computer workstations, each separated by small partitions. Also against the back wall, right next to Jens's desk, stood a large fridge with a glass door, stocked with beverages. On either side of the shop's entrance, tall display windows offered a clear view of the busy main road outside. Jens wearily lifted his gaze from the monitor and let it wander around the room in boredom. He had spent the last few hours reading countless Wikipedia articles and composing eloquent posts in various online forums where he was a member. He couldn't stare at the screen any longer. His eyes were burning. The monitor in front of him was the last CRT screen he still had in operation. All the customer workstations were equipped with flat screens, also somewhat outdated. Jens's eyes drifted to the display windows, and he watched the cars passing by outside. Then he checked his watch. 12:48 p.m. He sighed. An entire hour left until the end of his shift. After that, Farid, one of his 2 employees, would take over and run the cafe until closing time at 10 p.m. Farid was an exceptionally reliable worker, which couldn't exactly be said about Kai, the other employee. Kai had a habit of calling in sick unexpectedly, sometimes in the middle of a shift, forcing Jens to give up his precious free time to cover for him. But when Farid was on duty, Jens could relax. Farid could be counted on.
Jens was abruptly startled by the shrill ringtone of his phone. It was Manu. He answered. What's up?
Hello, crackled a faint voice on the other end of the line.
Jens?
The connection seems a bit poor, Jens replied. He had often experienced poor reception in the ground floor apartment, making phone calls rather tricky.
Can you hear me, Manu?
Yes, now I can, Mana replied. Listen, Jens. I have an urgent question. It might so. A crackling sound interrupted his words, a bit strange.
Manu? Yes. Can you hear me?
A loud burst of static covered his voice again. Jens rolled his eyes in exasperation. Manu, are you unable to make it? Is that why you're calling?
No, came the clipped response.
I need to know if I'm Can you tell me to figure out if I'm dreaming? I think, losing my mind. What? Jens said. He wasn't sure he had understood Mana correctly. Did you just ask me if you're dreaming?
Yes, came Manu's crackling voice. How can tell if I'm dreaming?
What the? Jens thought, dumbfounded. Was Mana pulling his leg? Right now? Jens asked. Yes, came the curt reply. And why would you need to know? Jens couldn't resist asking. I think derealization. Manu's agitated voice crackled through. Help me. Jens had no idea what was going on with Manu, but he could hear the desperation in his voice.
He thought for a moment and then said.
You need to count your fingers, several times in a row. If you have more than 10 or fewer, you're probably dreaming. That's one way.
He paused. Did you catch that, Manu? Yes, came the tinny reply.
Good. There's another way, Jens continued. Pinch your nose shut with your hand and try to breathe through it. That only works in a dream. But, Mana, Jens hesitated. You can trust me when I say you're not dreaming right now. I don't know what's going on, but I'll tell you. Later. Connection's bad. Mana interrupted him. Thanks, was the last thing Jens heard before the line went dead.
Jens stared at his phone in disbelief.
He had no idea what had happened to Mana since last night, but from the sound of it, it must have been something significant. Manu, who had just performed the reality checks Jens had suggested, was still plagued by gnawing doubts. Sure, he clearly had 10 fingers, and breathing through his pinched nose had proven impossible. But this result hadn't brought the relief he had hoped for. It was only now dawning on him that Jens, and the entire phone call with him, could just as well be part of the dream, assuming Manu was indeed dreaming, as everything else he had experienced that day. This included Dr. Berg's reassurances that he needn't worry about his state of mind. This logical flaw should have occurred to him earlier, but in his panic, he hadn't given it much thought. Instead, the idea of calling Jens had seemed like a lifeline, one he had grabbed for as desperately as a drowning man clutching at a straw. This realization only deepened his concerns. Manu knew that in dreams, logical reasoning was often impaired, a further indication he might actually be asleep. On the other hand, if this were true, it would mean he couldn't trust his thoughts or conclusions at all, not even the one he had just reached. But this would only hold if he truly was dreaming, which he still didn't know.
A classic catch, 22, with the snake eating its own tail.
The point was, he had no reliable way of determining his actual state. All he could really do was flow along with whatever happened next, remaining vigilant for inconsistencies or further impossibilities, like the sudden disappearance of the young woman earlier. What he would do after that, he didn't yet know. But if he really was dreaming, he would have to wake up at some point, and then everything would be fine. Then, however, a horrifying thought crept in. What if his ability to distinguish between waking and dreaming states was completely breaking down? In that case, even waking up again, or so it would seem, wouldn't resolve his dilemma, because the same doubts would immediately resurface. After all, that's exactly what had happened to him this morning, which was why he had visited Dr. Berg in the first place. If that were true, he had two equally grim ways of looking at it. Either he was stuck in a never-ending nightmare where the best he could hope for was a false awakening. Or he was awake but suffering from an acute loss of reality because something inside him was coming loose. Either way, the outlook was bleak, unless something happened soon to restore his sense of reality.
Visions of straitjackets and hospital food were already haunting him.
His thoughts raced wildly in circles as he stood before the small wrought iron gate marking the southern entrance to the little grove. He slowly looked down at himself, and his gaze fell on the black feather in his hand. She just vanished, he thought, exhausted, and tucked the feather into his jacket pocket. It was a good thing he would be seeing Jens soon, as Mana could really use his grounding presence. With him, he could talk everything over in detail, and perhaps Jens would manage to bring Mana back down to earth, assuming such a thing still existed. Just thinking about his best friend brought Mana some relief, calming his agitated mind slightly. Real or dream figure, if anyone knew what to do in this situation or could give him sound advice, it was Jens. Jens, who always kept a cool head and was a textbook example of a good friend. By the time Mana reached the tall, glass-paneled building that was the city mall, located right on the edge of the Old Town district, he was already feeling a bit better. After some back and forth, he had finally decided to pull himself together and carry out his shopping as planned. He could use a touch of normality right now, even if he still felt raw and vulnerable, which in turn was triggering his social anxiety. But his fridge wouldn't fill itself, and this was also an opportunity to reward himself with a forest berry smoothie, his favorite drink.
Maybe that would calm him down further. Comfort food principle.
He steeled himself and stepped through the automatic glass doors into the mall. A short while later, he reached the nearer of the two discount grocery stores housed within, its entrance crowned by a large illuminated sign reading "Cheap Keep." Mana considered what he needed and how much he could carry. He quickly decided to just buy the essentials for now and handle the rest at the supermarket around the corner in the coming days. He didn't feel like lugging too much today. He needed bread, butter, cheese, milk for the muesli he still had on his shelf, and his morning coffee, and a smoothie. Lately, Manu's diet had been rather poor, but he had resolved to soon start cooking more often, fresh meals with plenty of vegetables, as soon as the antidepressant he was taking hopefully kicked in and gave him more energy. He could barely stand the sight of processed food anymore. Yet it was so convenient, so today, he'd fall back on it once again. He mentally added a twin pack of frozen pizzas, the cheap kind, to his shopping list. He could store them in Jens's freezer for now if they didn't eat them. As he wandered the aisles gathering his groceries, Manu noticed a gaunt, darkly dressed man behaving strangely. The man had long hair tied back in a ponytail, a black leather coat, and heavy black lace-up boots. At first, Mana hadn't paid him much attention, aside from his hollowed-out face, which Mana had noticed when his gaze briefly passed over him. But a little later, Mana became aware that the man was somehow always nearby, eyeing him slyly. When Mana stopped, so did the man, though he kept his distance. Yet whenever Mana glanced at him, the man would quickly avert his gaze and pretend to inspect an item on the shelf or focus on a price tag. Moreover, the supermarket was quite large. Had it been smaller, Mana might have chalked it all up to coincidence, as two customers might naturally cross paths more frequently. But under these circumstances, the man's behavior struck Manu as highly suspicious. When Manu eventually queued at the register, the man was soon standing behind him.
Manu grew nervous.
The young woman in the little grove had told him he was in mortal danger. What if she was right? He turned, trying to appear casual, as if looking for something he had forgotten.
But the man deliberately stared past him.
A little later, when Mana couldn't resist glancing back again, the man was still staring straight ahead. This time, however, he had a wide grin on his face, revealing a set of decayed, brown stumps of teeth. His eyes gleamed maliciously.
Manu's heart skipped a beat.
Then, suddenly, the man raised his hand and began waving, his grin growing even wider. Mana quickly turned around and saw that near the exit stood a woman, also grinning and waving. Mana sighed in relief. The man's grin hadn't been directed at him. Had he imagined everything? Soon it was his turn at the register. He hastily bagged his groceries, paid by card, and turned to leave. As he passed the woman, who was dressed rather inconspicuously compared to the man, their eyes met briefly. Then she pulled her mouth into a thin smile and looked away. Shortly after, Mana exited the building and looked around for an e-scooter. While he stood there, groceries in hand, a noticeably younger, athletic-looking man jogged up to him.
"Excuse me," the man said with a boyish grin. "Do you know where Prinzenallee is? It should be nearby." He looked around cluelessly and added, "Must be somewhere around here." He grinned again, his teeth widened strong.
Manu, still shaken and wishing he could crawl away to somewhere people-free, found this grinning unpleasant. It felt so intrusive. He glanced away, thinking. He had never heard of the street. No, sorry, doesn't ring a bell. The young man looked disappointed. "Oh, so you're not from here?" Manu, now growing irritated, answered curtly no. "Well then, sorry to bother you," said the young man. As Mana turned to leave, the man called out again, "Excuse me." Reluctantly, Mana turned back.
"Can you at least tell me the time?"
Mana hesitated. Sure, he replied, pulling out his phone. 1:20.
The man grinned again.
"Thanks, buddy. Have a great day." Before Mana could leave, he added, "One more thing. Are you sure you're not from here?"
Manu began to find the situation strange.
Then he noticed the darkly dressed man and the woman from the supermarket standing a few meters away, watching them.
Suddenly, a ringtone sounded.
The young man pulled a phone from his pocket and raised a finger, as if signaling Mana to wait. Mana stiffened. Why had he asked for the time if he had a phone?
Something was definitely off.
His gaze flicked back to the man and woman from the supermarket.
The man glared at him darkly, while the woman openly grinned.
Then he heard the young man speak softly into his phone. "Yes, we've got him."
He lowered the phone.
Manu froze. Cold panic gripped him, leaving him paralyzed with shock. He watched as the young man grinned at him again and slowly walked over to join the other two. The man in the leather coat continued to glare, while the woman gave Manu a long, knowing look and began to laugh. The younger man started clapping his fist into his other hand. A surge of adrenaline flooded Manu's body, making his knees go weak. The woman doubled over with laughter, her wild eyes flashing like those of a madwoman. The dark aura surrounding the three figures, their sheer somberness and malice, made Manu's skin crawl. They knew he knew, and they let him know it in return. Manu felt a cold, sudden terror. These psychopaths were going to kill him in broad daylight, right there on the street, and they wouldn't care who was watching. He took 2 slow steps back. Then, abruptly, he turned and ran.
"15."
After running about half a mile and rounding several street corners, Mana came to a breathless halt, fearfully looking around. He was on the verge of randomly ringing the doorbell at one of the nearby houses to beg for shelter when his eyes fell on a greeny scooter parked a short distance away at the edge of the sidewalk. He hurried toward it, fumbling for his phone in his pocket to unlock the scooter via app. This should get me to Jens's place in about 10 minutes, Mana thought. If he took back routes instead of following the main road directly, he'd have a better chance of losing his presumed pursuers. He clumsily secured his phone in the designated holder on the scooter's handlebars. Then, pressing the throttle, the scooter jerked into motion. As he zipped through the residential area, occasionally using narrow bike paths that connected the quiet streets, he kept glancing back to check for any signs of pursuit. After traveling for some time and beginning to calm down slightly, Mana started questioning whether the entire situation had been real or if his frazzled mind was simply conjuring up ghosts. Then his eyes caught a dark van parked about 50 feet ahead at a crossroads. The vehicle was half on the curb along the street branching off to the right, where Mana was headed. The van was a dull black-gray and looked thoroughly run down. Patches of reddish primer showed through in places. The metal was dented in several large spots, and the front bumper hung low. The windows were tinted, further accentuating its ominous appearance. Manu instinctively slowed down, uncertain about what to do. His first impulse was to turn around. But what if someone was pursuing him from that direction? He might run straight into their hands. He decided on the spot to keep going straight, but at maximum speed. In about 200 meters, there was a bike path barred to cars that cut through a small wooded area, his best chance of escaping if the van was indeed after him. As he passed the van, he glimpsed two broad-shouldered figures inside through the rolled-down driver's window. Their faces were obscured by black scarves adorned with white skull prints. Mana stared at the men in shock as he sped by. The driver casually raised a gloved hand and waved at him, wiggling his fingers one by one. Mana tried pressing the throttle further, but it was already at its limit. When the van was a good distance behind him, he looked back and saw it slowly turning around, heading down the street in the opposite direction. Manu's pounding heart began to calm slightly, and he let out a sigh of relief. Still, he couldn't rely on the idea that he was in the clear. The van's occupants might have anticipated his plan to take the wooded path and intended to cut him off on the other side. However, Manu figured they likely had no clue where he was headed. Jens's building was near the wooded area, which also had multiple exits. They couldn't possibly know which one he'd use, assuming, of course, they were actually after him. As he weaved through the wooded path, Manu's thoughts raced wildly. Too much had happened that day, leaving him utterly confused. His head felt like it was on the verge of exploding. All he wanted was for this dreadful emotional roller coaster, which had started that morning, to finally end. But first, he needed clarity about his situation, somehow. His mind was torn by so many conflicting emotions that he could barely think straight. Was he dreaming or awake? Was he truly being hunted, and if so, why? Or was he merely descending into severe paranoia and delusion?
Each scenario demanded a very different course of action.
A part of him, the part still striving for rationality, thought it wise to revisit Dr. Berg the next day. It was entirely possible that everything he had experienced, or believed he had experienced, was a side effect of his medication. Dr. Berg had even admitted that the drug was likely causing his intense dreams, which were arguably the root, or at least the starting point, of his entire ordeal that day. Another part of him countered vigorously. If dark figures were genuinely after his life, a suspicion that couldn't easily be dismissed after what had just happened, he should immediately follow the young woman's advice from the grove. Waste no time and flee to Portugal. He still didn't understand why Portugal, but the mysterious stranger had made it clear that this was his only chance of escaping his pursuers. It was maddening. No matter how he turned the situation over in his mind, he simply didn't have enough information to reach a solid conclusion about his next steps. The whole ordeal felt like one of those holographic flip pictures from his childhood that came with certain gum brands. The image shifted depending on the angle from which you viewed it.
It was a perfect metaphor for his current predicament.
Mana resolved that it wouldn't hurt to gather as much information as possible about this pata thing the woman had mentioned, which she had said was his salvation. Reaching the edge of the wooded area that led to Jens's house, Mana slowed down and carefully checked to ensure no cars or suspicious individuals were nearby. Finding no sign of anyone, he sped off at full throttle, completing the final stretch of his journey to his great relief, entirely unbothered. Upon arriving at the internet cafe, Mana parked the scooter a short distance away, tucking it into a niche between buildings to keep it out of sight, just to be safe. He gave one last thorough glance around, and seeing neither pursuers nor anything unusual, he took a deep breath and entered the cafe. The internet cafe was relatively empty. Besides Jens, only 2 other people were seated at the computers. When Mana stepped through the door, Jens involuntarily looked up. Then, noticing how pale Manu was and the expression on his face, Jens stood up and said, "Manu, you're already here. What on earth just happened?" Manu, suddenly realizing how utterly exhausted he was, visibly struggled to hold back tears. "This is the absolute worst day of my life," he finally choked out, breaking into sobs. Jens, who had never seen his friend so distraught, hurried around his desk to embrace him. But Manu, apparently determined to pull himself together, quickly composed himself and stepped away. "Jens," he said in an urgent tone, his voice rough. "Can you please lower the blinds so no one can see inside? I think I'm being followed." Jens looked at him in alarm, then obediently turned toward the large windows. He cast a quick, cautious glance in both directions down the street before lowering the blinds with a squeak.
He hesitated. "Should I call the police?"
Mana shook his head. "If I tell them what happened, they'll think I'm crazy." Jens nodded silently. He thought back to Manu's phone call earlier and his bizarre question about whether he was dreaming. "Want a glass of water?" Jens finally asked. Mana shook his head again. "I've got a smoothie." Jens almost smiled, if he hadn't been so worried about his friend's state. That response was just so. "Manu."
He placed a hand on Manu's shoulder, looking at him with concern.
"I can't leave here until 2 o'clock, when Farid takes over," Jens said. "But I can let you into the apartment upstairs if you'd feel safer there." Mana shook his head firmly. "No, I'll wait here. I don't want to be alone with my thoughts right now. And anyway," he glanced hesitantly at the windows, "with the blinds down, no one outside can see me." "Okay," Jens said, squeezing his friend's shoulder before letting go. He glanced at his watch. "It's 20 to 2 now. Maybe Farid will get here a little early, and then it won't be as long." Mana nodded. "I'll manage." Then he looked at the computers. "I think I'll sit at one of the PCs, if that's okay. I need to do some research."
Jens frowned in concern.
"I'll explain everything upstairs, when we can talk in private," Manu added. Jens would have preferred to hear it now, but he quickly replied, "Of course, no problem." He smiled reassuringly at Manu.
"And if anything comes up, I'm right here." Manu nodded again. He was genuinely grateful for that.
He headed to one of the PCs at the back of the room near Jens's desk, draped his jacket over the chair, and took his smoothie from the shopping bag. Jens, back at his desk, unlocked the PC for him. When the start screen lit up, Mana took a moment to collect himself. He sipped his smoothie, just what he needed, and opened the browser. He tried to recall the name of the plant the mysterious woman in the grove had mentioned. Something with an N. He couldn't remember and instead typed Pata de Pantera plant South America into the search bar.
The top result was a Wikipedia link. Manu clicked it and read.
Virgulta feline, also known as Pata, Pata de Pantera, Nahu, Newang, Panga, and Maiarai, is a dwarf shrub native to the southwestern Amazon. It is revered as a sacrament by many indigenous tribes of the region and used in shamanic healing ceremonies. The plant contains DMT, along with smaller amounts of 5-MeO-DMT and bufotenin, as well as compounds typically found in psychoactive cacti such as peyote and San Pedro, though these belong to entirely different plant families. Because of this unique composition, locals of the regions where the plant grows call it El Patron, the patron, and El Antepasado, the ancestor, claiming it harmoniously combines the properties of various plantas sagradas, sacred plants. They also venerate the higher intelligence or deity said to reside in the plant as an active mediator who connects sincere practitioners to other plant spirits and ancestral beings, revealing when and how to use specific plants appropriately. Mana paused. This all sounded wildly exotic to his Western ears. He recalled reading years ago in National Geographic about Brazilian rainforest tribes using psychoactive plant brews for ceremonies such as initiation and funeral rites. He had only skimmed the article and never imagined he might encounter something similar himself. The only drug experience he had ever had was as a teenager when he'd taken a puff from a joint at a house party. It had made him nauseous, given him a racing heart, and disrupted his short-term memory, making conversations seem like they were stuck on repeat. He'd felt no enjoyable effects and had never tried anything else since.
In terms of mind-altering substances, Manu was a blank slate.
He skimmed the rest of the short Wikipedia entry, which mostly covered botanical nomenclature and pharmacological properties, information that felt like gibberish to him. Clicking back to the search results, he scrolled through the entries until a forum post caught his eye. Holy shit, literally. Intrigued, he clicked the link and landed on a forum called Bright Fallen Stars. The post was in the Healing and Magical Plants section and titled, My Mind-Blowing Experience with Pata de Pantera. Mana read, Last night, I participated in a small private Pata ceremony led by a couple loosely associated with a Tibetan Buddhist retreat center in southern France, where I had previously attended a week-long meditation retreat. J and M live near the retreat center and regularly attend its courses, but they hold no official roles there. They offered the Pata ceremony privately to retreat participants who were interested and felt ready to delve into deeper layers of their unconscious. J and M are longtime meditators and, according to their own account, have also trained with various shamans over several years. The Pata ceremonies take place exclusively in a private setting provided by them, which, as they emphasize, has no connection to the Tibetan Center. While the center tolerates J and M recruiting potential participants, it otherwise plays no official role in the process. Last night's ceremony had 4 participants. Around 5 p.m., we arrived at their idyllic country house, surrounded by dense forest, where we were served herbal tea grown in their garden. 3 of the 4 participants had completed the retreat at the aforementioned Buddhist center, while 1 woman had traveled from farther away specifically to take part in the ceremony. The 6 of us sat comfortably in the spacious, bright living room, which had a view of the garden, sipping herbal tea. J and M took turns asking each participant about their motivations for engaging in a conversation with Abuelito, Spanish for little grandfather, as they affectionately called the plant. They also wanted to know more about our current life circumstances, general emotional state, and what we hoped to gain from the ceremony. The answers were varied. I shared that I had been struggling with depressive moods and a loss of meaning for quite some time. I had longed to experience emotional depth and joy again, the kind I had felt as a child. Perhaps due to certain pivotal experiences in my life, these feelings had slipped away, as though those events weighed heavily on my soul and blocked my inner flow of life. I also explained that my regular meditation practice had already helped me become more aware of certain unconscious blockages and approach them with greater calmness and self-compassion. J responded by saying that with these concerns, I was in exactly the right place, and that Abuelito would further open my eyes and help me find the answers to my unresolved life questions. Mana stopped reading, startled by the phrase, a plant that opens people's eyes, the same words the woman in the grove had used. At that moment, the door to the internet cafe opened and Farid walked in. Manu flinched slightly, his nerves still raw. Pulling out his phone, Mana quickly noted the name of the forum while Farid and Jens exchanged a few words, and Farid took over for Jens. Logging out of the PC, Mana saw Jens approach and say, "Let's go." They said goodbye to Farid and exited the cafe, walking around the building to reach its main entrance. Jens unlocked the door, and they climbed the stairs to Jens's top-floor apartment.